It's Our Community, and I'm Mary Davidson, and I'm so glad you're here. Our guest today is Dr. Doug Harvey, and Doug is an adjunct associate professor of history here at Johnson County Community College and also a lecturer at the University of Kansas. But the most important thing that he has done, and that we're going to talk to him about, is a book that he's written, and it's called The Theater of Empire, Frontier Performances in America, 1750 to 1860. Now that sounds kind of heavy-duty stuff, Doug, and it is heavy-duty stuff, but what the book does is look at how the new American Republic adopted an attitude of imperial expansion as it crossed the Appalachians, appropriating land and resources. Now, is that a fair assessment of what you have done?
Well, actually, it does do that.
Oh, good. I'm relieved. Oh my goodness.
There are other people who have done that as well. What I do is bring the performances into it on both sides of the frontier. So.
And for performances, we need to tell them that those are plays and theatrical efforts that were given. But before we begin on that, I need to know the difference between expansionism and imperial expansionism. Is there a difference?
If there is one, I don't know what it is.
Because I noticed both of those terms.
I typically, in this book, and in my mind, I think I use expansionism as a shorthand for imperial expansion.
Okay, well, I just want to be sure that we were both talking about the same thing. I guess that you make one really important assumption in this book that we have to make together if we're going to go ahead, and that is that the Anglo-Saxon supremacy of the English-speaking people in the new nation saw it both good and saw it as right to displace the Indians and enslave blacks.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear in the historical record that there were that was indeed an assumption.
But it was considered okay.
Yeah, by most, not all, but most.
Okay. The stock theater plays of the day shaped that thinking. Did they?
Yeah, I think it both reflected it and helped create it and maintain it, because people in a relatively free society that we had in the colonial world and then in the early republic, people want to, they spend their money to go see what they want to go see. And if it isn't something that they like, they're not going to spend their money. So it had to be something that made them, that reflected well upon them. And if you're showing a critique of the Indians, the land you just took from the Shawnee and the Delaware, chances are they're not going to buy a ticket. And that's what it really was all about.
So it had to be something that didn't go down, as I say, like a square pill. It was something that was of fun.
Right, and I mentioned a play in there. Actually, it was what we call a closet play. It's a play written that's never performed. It's not meant to be performed. It's just written in play form by a guy named Joseph Doddridge in Ohio in 1823. And he was very critical of, and he was a community builder and leader of the community, a doctor. He was very critical of all the expansion of land usurpation and the killing of Indians. And it's really quite a Jeremiah against expansion.
Well, tell me something. You say it's a play that was never meant to be performed. Why did he write it? What was the purpose?
It's meant to be read.
It's meant to be read,
yeah.
but not performed.
Yeah, and it was published as recently as 1979, actually, in West Virginia.
Really?
So it's still around.
So the Blackface minstrels and the Redface performances were fun, and people went to see them, and they hooted and hollered, as they say.
Yeah, and those came along a little later, towards the end of this time period. The Redface was whites painting their faces kind of reddish and getting up and acting like Indians.
Well, let's talk about one of the plays that you talk about, and Mrs. Hatten and her play, and she called it the Songs of Tammany, or the Indian Chief, and it was a serious opera. Talk about that a little bit. And tell them who Tammany was.
Well, Tammany was Delaware Indian chief who famously signed a treaty with William Penn in Pennsylvania in 1673, and it's one of the it's fondly remembered by historians as an example of peaceful relations between Indian and white, and the land was purchased. It was all on the up and up, and everyone knew, both sides, the Indians and whites, both sides knew what the deal was, which is fairly rare. But
well,
Tammany,
he may have known what the deal was, but he may not have known what the repercussions down the line of that
right,
deal.
and the Quakers, Penn and the Quakers really had no intention of those repercussions happening. It's just the immigration into the colonies just got out of hand, and they lost control of the situation. And Pennsylvania became, especially with the French-Indian War, Pennsylvania became a scene of war.
Well, and the fishing companies thought it was a really good thing, too.
Right, and then when you get to the early republic, the artisans had adopted Tammany as their kind of patron saint. In fact, they called him Saint Tammany. And there's I quote a long song in that play.
Can you quote a couple of lines from it?
Oh, well.
I can't. I remember seeing it. But it was a song that was talking about the good things that had happened to them because Tammany had signed that agreement.
Yeah, and Tammany is what it kind of does, and this is what a lot of so-called red-face plays do, is they assume, Anglo-North Americans assume an indigenous identity through association with the Indians. So by making Tammany a patron saint of the Philadelphia artisans, they basically take over ownership of North America in some kind of deep mythical way. And there are other plays where that's illustrated that I talk about in the book as well.
The audience for these plays that we're talking about now, were they more blue-collar type audiences, or were they, who went to see?
For Tammany, that was a working class play, and there was a clear divide in the early Republic, and but it would even become more clear, kind of as it is today. I mean, someone who comes to the Carlson Center to hear a string quartet is probably not the same crowd that's going to go hear a rap show downtown. But in the early Republic, there was nevertheless a divide that reflected class and it reflected politics. So this play by Mrs. Hatten would have been a pretty wild working class. It would have been more like a rock concert kind of crowd.
Kind of like the crowd that might have looked at Shakespearean plays at the Globe Theater.
Yeah. And same way with the blackface performances. That was another.
Talk a little bit about Bunker Hill, or the death of General Warren. That was a kind of interesting idea.
Yeah, the Bunker Hill. It's an interesting event in and of itself, but General Warren was, I think, lionized in that play. General Warren had just recently received a commission as a general in the British Army, and he resigned his commission and entered the Continental Army as a private to assist in this assault on Boston from Bunker Hill. Joined the Continental Army as a private, and was killed as they retreated. And because of this play, he became a national hero.
Deserved or not?
Oh, I think so. When you give up a generalship in the British Army, the greatest empire in the world, to become a private with a bunch of ragtag army of farmers because of principle, that's...
So that truly hit a note.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Now, we can't continue this conversation, I don't think, without talking about the circus.
Oh, yeah.
And John Bill Ricketts. And John Bill Ricketts was 1765. Now we're talking early here. Talk about old John Bill Ricketts.
He's one of my favorite guys. I love the circus. Yeah, Ricketts started, he got involved with circus, and at the time, 1780s, 1790s is when he was real active. Circus was mostly equestrian performance. meaning doing tricks on horseback, doing a jig while riding around the ring at full gallop, things like juggling on the back of a horse. And Ricketts and John Durang started this circus, which I talk about in one chapter. And what fascinated me about Ricketts' tour, he went on a tour up the Hudson Valley to Canada, which is what I talk about. It's been published elsewhere too. That he had Indian audiences at times, and they would take stuff that they learned from the Indians and bring it into to their own show. So it was very much a working class, even peasant. When you get to Canada, there's kind of a peasantry up there at the time. That was his audience, and it's pretty fascinating that. And some of the anecdotes, I mean, they built their own theaters from local materials. Imagine that. Some actors, a circus showing up, and they get the stones from the surrounding hillside and they actually build a theater.
So you had to be a multitasker.
Oh, yeah. The Renaissance.
But what part did John Bill Ricketts play in this ongoing, the Indians must go and the blacks are subservient?
Well, that's the interesting thing about Ricketts is I think that represents kind of in some ways a path not taken because they were much more sympathetic, and I talk about John Durang borrowing some of the Indian dances that he used in his own Redface performance. I think they were much more sympathetic towards the Indians than most theater audiences.
See, I think that's interesting.
It is fascinating.
And because most of the people, as we said, that saw these performances in general were somewhat plebeian, but John Adams did write on the subject, and you quote him, and I would like to quote. John Adams did not think this way, as he quoted about his memory of Indians. And he said, I, in my boyish rambles, used to call at their wigwam, where I never failed to be treated with whortleberries, blackberries, strawberries, apples, plums, or peaches, for they had planted a variety of fruit trees around them, and on and on. He spoke very kindly of his Indian neighbors.
Yeah, and many did. Where you really get the phenomenon of Indian hating is out on the frontier. And John Adams, New England is one of the places where there were fairly cordial relations at times with the Indians, and Pennsylvania, because of religious beliefs. I mean, it wasn't always that way. It's different in different places at different times. It's complicated, but that is a quote. I think, if I remember right, in that HBO miniseries on John Adams, starring Paul Giamatti, I think they put those words into his mouth. Yeah.
Well, because I think they're interesting words given the tenor of the times.
Yeah, they are.
And
definitely. Now
we're going to begin moving west a little bit, and we need to talk about Thomas Dartmouth Daddy Rice.
Daddy Rice.
Daddy Rice was quite a guy, and he performed as Jim Crow.
Right. This is where the term Jim Crow comes from, and he was a theater actor at the time, 1820s, 1830s. We're talking about that era.
Now we're moving a little bit farther along in the historical timeline.
And further
west.
Down and further west, the Ohio Valley, Louisville, Cincinnati. It was called the Kentucky Circuit. Went from Cincinnati to Lexington and up and down the river. And Tom Rice, as his co-workers called him, it was later he became Daddy Rice, but he was just kind of a junior actor who couldn't get a job in New York or Philadelphia, so he came out west. And so the legend goes, he saw a crippled slave in cleaning out a barn, and this slave was singing a song about Jim Crow, and he was doing a little dance. So this is legend, folklore now. It's not good hard sources, but it's been with us for a long time. This folklore. Daddy Rice bought the clothes off the slave's back, and wore them that night on stage and did the dance, sang the song, and people loved it, called him back for several encores, and then he started developing that act.
Would you call him a hater of blacks or just a performer? He was just a performer.
And that was the beginning of this, what became blackface minstrelsy, where whites would get on stage and black up.
But the interesting point here, Doug, is that it wasn't done out of hate.
Right. No, it was done to make a living in the theater.
Make a living in the theater. Yeah. But in doing so, it fueled the attitude of conquest and subservience.
Well, it fueled the attitude that blacks are inferior.
Right, right.
And that it just helped justify slavery. And I think, but it's complicated. Again, because that's my thesis, you know, I tend to focus on that aspect. But you can find blackface performances that are very critical of rich people, people who what would be called capitalists, and it was a way for working class whites to get on stage, put on a mask, and then critique society and get away with it. So that was another aspect of that, at the same time it created and perpetuated a stereotype.
Well, I might suggest to you too that it was a whole genre of the common person, the common man, and the things that appealed to him and the place that he wished to retain in the society that was moving west.
Yeah, it was it's both, you know, it's hopes and dreams, and it was you know, going to the theater was an escape from the harshness of daily life as well, and you know, that's been discussed quite a bit is the working class audiences of the 19th century. But,
well, and you contrast the contrast that you present, or that I saw that you presented in the book, was one of the sustainable cultures with the land hunger and the exploitation of the colonial culture.
Yes, I'm glad you raised that point, because that is kind of getting to the heart of the book, where I'm contrasting, and this is what's new about this book, I'm contrasting the indigenous performances with these theater performances that we've been talking about. And if you look at the indigenous performances, one of the things that's most different about them is there's a lot of other things in it besides human beings. There are all kinds of animals. There are bears, there are, you know, the birds, even fish. Human beings are just another character in the play, but the play itself is, or the ritual or performance, ceremony, whatever you want to call it, is
what was propaganda?
I wouldn't call it propaganda. I would call it it was the ritual that they lived. It was the myth that they lived in these indigenous cultures. And the purpose of my book is to contrast that with this expanding society. So,
well, you know, we have empire in today's world as well.
Oh yeah.
And the media has taken the place of some of these performers.
Yeah, and that's what got me going on this topic. I've always had an interest in myth and how assumptions are put together to create myths, and how it is that societies believe things that may not be true, but everybody believes it, everybody assumes it's true. And so I just started tracing it back up the family tree, as it were, you know, to get, how did this work around the time of the American Revolution, I asked. But yes, I agree that, and I think the world knows that cable TV in the U.S. now is largely a mythic construction, at least part of it is, and so.
Well, and you make the point that performances do create assumptions.
Yeah,
and these performances, early performances created assumptions. The media now creates assumptions. And to some degree, I would suggest that it governs the behavior of society to a certain.
I would agree. One of my mentors and great influences was the mythologist, comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell, and he discusses at length in many books, excuse me, how myths are created and how they work in societies, all different kinds of societies. So,
well, you quote John Neihart in the book, and John Neihart was my teacher.
Really?
He was at the University of
Well,
Missouri.
consider me honored.
And he said something that I thought was interesting. He said, I think that many will grant that the religious sense, as now operating in the multitude, has exchanged a spiritual for a material scale of values. That it is still truly the religious sense, however, if may be disguised or denied, and that the fact of the transference dominates our time.
I love that quote.
I do too.
Yeah.
He was a privilege.
We'll have to talk about that.
I would be delighted to. So do you think that these assumptions then finally do coalesce? In other words, we have disparate assumptions out there.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes them coalesce?
I think in part time, and just kind of the unrelenting nature of the society we live in. It just kept expanding. Remember, we started on the eastern seaboard, a nation of farmers, and we began expanding. And our economy is still expanding. As I say in the opening pages of the book, we have a presence in over 700 locations around the world. That's expansion, and so these myths that are created here in the early republic, even in the going into the colonial era, are still with us.
We have another quote in the book that I thought was good. Her name is Kathleen Wilson, and
Yes.
she said, "Empire was at heart about trade, commerce, accumulation, and consumption, and as such augmented national as well as individual wealth and power," which leads me to ask you then, how does empire disrupt and reorder the lives of ordinary people?
It depends on which end of it. Depends on whether or not you're on the bulldozer or under the bulldozer. If you live somewhere where the empire needs what you have, the resources that you have, say, just to pull an example out of the air, oil,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to have a very different experience with the empire than if you are selling gasoline down on the corner in Overland Park, Kansas.
Yeah.
So
Accumulation and consumption differs depending on who that person,
on which end of the chain
I was
you're
going to
on,
say,
yes.
on what level that person stands in the society.
Mhm.
I think that's kind of interesting.
It is.
But it nevertheless, empire affects everyone, although differently.
Definitely.
Yeah, so I think that's, we need to talk about Saul Smith, Noah Ludlow, and William Dunlap and Philip Freneau, because they then come down to the Civil War time and lead up to the Empire and the Republic again. Talk about them a little bit.
Yeah, these guys are fascinating in so many ways. Philip Freneau, I don't know as much about him. William Dunlap, however, was manager of early theater in New York City, and he
We're going back on the East Coast again.
Yeah, he was a very interesting guy. He wrote a lot of his own plays. He didn't like plays like the Hatten play we talked about earlier.
Why?
He considered it bombast. It wasn't art. This is just bombast for the plebes.
Well, and it may have been.
And it was, and he was right. And but you had to sell tickets.
Yeah.
And so what he bemoaned was that there was no other funding for the theater. You know, today we have National Endowment for the Arts, for example, where there's lots of money available, and other private foundations where theater companies could get money. Not so in 1790. Or 1800 in New York. So that's one of the
and actors
things
were not thought of very highly either.
Not at all.
No.
It was usually, some were disowned by their families completely. I mean, cut out of the will, and so.
Not remembered.
And they would call it getting bit by the bug. If you got bit by the bug of acting, it was a curse in many ways, because now you had to do it, but yet it put you on the fringe of society. But so that's Dunlap. At Saul Smith, it gets even more interesting. The Ludlow and Smith Company. This is the first professional theater company in the West, and by West I mean west of the Appalachian Mountains. And they did much to bring these stock plays, Redface performance, Blackface performance, to the little towns in the South and in the West, in Illinois and in Missouri, to some extent. St. Louis is where they were based, Alabama, Georgia, and it's fascinating to read their. Smith has a memoir, and it's a really fun read.
Well, and we do have to point out that all of this happened right on the heels of the Civil War.
Right. It was in the antebellum period. I think their company went from 1835 to 1853, something like that. Ludlow was pro-slave. Smith was anti-slave, and they basically didn't like each other very much.
But those contradictions were out there, and
that's right.
And they were of great influence. You also posit in your writings here that the natural world is a big place, and that the consequences of imperial hubris are catching up with us, quote, end quote. Will you explain yourself, sir?
Sure. Well, I think it's apparent that we have our resource base is limited. There are those who are denying this in very loud voices, but the facts are that we are running out of certain resources. Certain resources are finite. For example, oil. Again, and so what I'm arguing in my book is that you notice in indigenous performance, with all these other entities involved in the performance, you have a much more pristine environment.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't really a wilderness. It was but it was pretty pristine and clean because they took care of it. Whereas the empire that I argue has risen up in the last several hundred years, we've kind of ignored the consequences because
well, it's gotten a little dusty.
It's gotten at least a little dusty and a little oily, and the waters are fouled. And
so are you an optimist, Doug?
I'm always an optimist because it's less painful. But and I think that if you look over the course of history, people are basically good, and people will do what they need to do, but often they won't do it until they absolutely have to. I mean, that's the way I am.
Yeah.
You know,
So you think maybe it hasn't gotten bad enough yet?
I fear so.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I just think that your book is absolutely fascinating, and I would recommend it to you. It hasn't been out very long, so you'll be on the cutting edge of reading Doug Harvey's book, and I think it would be something that you may not agree with everything he says, and that's okay, but it would at least make you think. And so I would close, as I thank you, with Hamlet. And in saying the following words, he's relying on good, solid Renaissance psychology when he writes the following lines in Hamlet, encouraging virtue in upstanding citizens and caught in the conscience of malefactors. And he said, I'll have grounds more relative than this. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. And that is what it's all about. And Doug Harvey, I thank you so much. And
thank you very much.
I would encourage you to read Theater of Empire, Frontier Performances in America, 1750 to 1860, and it'll be interesting. I guarantee it. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for being with us. It is our community, and Doug is one of our neighbors.